Hey guys, it's Kaylor. Welcome to the YouTube channel. In this video, I want to cover negative space in UI design. In this video, we're going to go in depth about negative space or white space. I'm going to explain what it is and why it's important in UI design. I'm going to show several examples of how it's used in UI design and how you can manipulate it to do certain things like separate elements or group elements together. We're also going to cover some best practices, and I'm going to give you some tips to using it in UI design. So that's today's topic. I hope you guys are excited. Let's go ahead and get started with negative space. So first off, what is negative space or white space? The terms are interchangeable and they mean exactly the same thing. I prefer to say negative space because the space is not always white in color. It used to be called white space because of print mainly, because on print it's cheaper to print something on white because it doesn't use as much color. So they referred to the space that was blank as white space. But it's up to you which one you want to call it, negative space or white space. So what it is the area of the design that is quote unquote empty. It's the space around and between elements, and I would go as far as saying it's one of the most important UI design principles that you need to learn to get good at UI UX design, because you can do so much with space, and we're going to go over that in this video. So there's two types of negative space, being macro and micro, and you can use these terms to reference the different negative space in your designs. Macro space is the larger space. It's the space between layout elements, and micro space is the smaller space between elements. So if we have two buttons side by side, the space in between the buttons would be referred to as the macro negative space, or the negative macro space, and then the padding around the button text would be the negative micro space. So to explain how to manipulate negative space and how to use it in your designs, I'm going to reference the CSS Box Model. If you don't know CSS or any code, don't worry, I'm just using this as a good visual. So here in this scenario, we're going to use a button once again, and the text is going to be our main content. The space around that text is going to be our negative micro space. In this case, it's our padding. So that's how we would code this. We would add padding to this text to get this rectangle. Then the space around that we would refer to as the margin. So that could be also called the negative macro space in this scenario. So those are two ways you can manipulate the negative space: by adjusting the padding, making it larger or smaller, or adjusting the space around that element, making it closer, further away to other elements on the screen using margin. So not only can we adjust padding and margin, but we can adjust line height. Here in this example, I have some text, and you'll see that this is very unreadable because the text is really close together. If we increase the line height, however, it becomes much more readable. So we have three ways to manipulate negative space: through padding, margin, and line height. So next up, why is negative space important? Well, negative space gives us breathing room. It sorts out the clutter and it spaces out the elements in your design. So if you were just throwing a bunch of elements on the screen and adding content, it can become distracting and overload the user with too much information and too many interactive elements. You'll find this when working with clients. A lot of times they like to have content on the screen. They like to shove content on there, and that's not always a good thing. You want to limit how much the user has at one time, so that they don't get overloaded with too much information or interactive elements. So to use negative space effectively and clean up these cluttered designs, we need to know exactly how it works. So let's take a look at two really good examples of negative space. So in this example, I'm going to show you how you can use negative space to separate your layout. So if we have a layout that looks like this, and on the left I have some kind of sidebar content, then the right side is that main content section with that heading image and then the paragraph below it. So right now, all of our spacing, our negative space, is nice and consistent. It's all even. If we change the space between that sidebar and the rest of the content by just a little, you can see how that content is now separated from the rest of the main content even more. Instead of blending together, it is now a completely separate section. So you can use negative space to completely alter layouts by adjusting that space. And here's another example. So not only can we separate elements, but we can also have them perceived as being related or grouped together. So here I have a grid of squares, and let's say this is 20 pixel spacing, vertical and horizontal throughout this grid. So you perceive these elements as being related because they have all this white space around them and they're close together and they have even spacing. If I change the horizontal spacing on this just slightly, maybe bump it up 20, 40 pixels, it now changes from one giant group of squares to columns of squares. So these items now look related. So you can see how you can use negative space to group certain elements together and show relationships between elements. So with those two examples, you can see how much negative space can be an impact on your design or layout in your design. When I was learning UI UX design, I really didn't think about negative space all that much, but when I seen those two examples, it really opened my mind to how powerful it can be in my designs. And as you're designing, you should really be conscious of how you're using your space and how that is going to be perceived when people use your applications or your website. So now I want to go into some kind of practices and best tips of how I use negative space. I get asked quite a bit in my tutorials where I come up with my numbers and how I do it. So I'm going to show you some examples of that now. So this first example is very similar to the one in the beginning of the video. When it comes to typography and negative space, a lot of people get caught up in the aesthetic and how the design looks, and they forget about the readability sometimes. And so a lot of times people mess this one up. So a good rule of thumb that I like to do is if you're using a heading and a body text, take the height of your heading, divide it by 2, and that's your space between the heading and the body text. Now, if you're going to have a tagline, I like to take the height of the tagline and put that between the heading and the tagline. Then I take that grouping and I divide that height by 2, and that's the space between the heading and tagline and the body. When it comes to line height, it's hard to tell you exactly what size to do this one because with various different sizes of fonts, this number is going to change. So you want to make sure that if you look at the text, it's not too condensed together and it's not too spaced out apart. As long as you find a happy medium between those two, you're usually pretty much good. So that typography trick works really good for app design, but also web design as well. The next stuff I'm going to show you is mainly for app design, but it can apply to web design as well. So the first thing I like to do when I start off on designing an app screen is I like to set up some guides in Adobe XD. On the left and the right hand side, I usually set up 2 columns, and these are either 17 pixel width or 20 pixel width, depending on if I want to design in odd or even numbers. And I like to have that there so that none of my elements are too close to the screen. Now that doesn't mean all of my elements have to touch those margins, it just means that the area inside of those columns are safe for me. For the top value, you usually have a notch on the phone or the status bar up there. So if you download an Apple UI kit or an Android UI kit, that'll usually give you the numbers of how large that status bar is up there. And that'll give you a good idea of where you want to start designing on the top of the screen. So that's pretty much consistent through all of my app designs, either 17 pixels up to 20 pixel spacing on the left and the right, and making sure I have room for that status bar and the notch up top on the phone. Now, when it comes to the rest of the negative space throughout your app designs and web designs, I primarily create these by eye, but I'm sure there's a lot of great websites out there and articles that tell you what the most recommended spacing is or what this or that company uses. Basically, for this, I just want to stress consistency. So what I would recommend for a best practice on this is writing down the different spacings you're using throughout your app design in your style guide as you're creating your low fidelity and high fidelity wireframes so that you make sure your screens look consistent. You don't want your screens to look different like they're 2 different apps. So if on one screen you have 17 points in between your heading and body font, and then on the other screen you have the same size font, but 30 pixel spacing in between the heading and body, it just doesn't look consistent and it makes no sense. Unless there's a point to changing that, you want to make sure it is consistent. Other than the guidelines and tips I gave you in this video, there's really no other way to get good at negative space in UI design except practice. And if you're not working as a UI UX designer or doing something related to UI UX design every day, maybe check out something like the Daily UI that gives you a challenge for 100 days and at least gets you doing something UI related. Or if you have a very busy schedule, maybe try my weekly design challenge. I host that on my Discord. I'll have a video on the screen now that will tell you all about that and how to participate, as well as there's a sign-up link for my Discord down in the description that has over 1,500 current and inspiring UI UX designers and front-end developers that you can talk to, get great feedback from, and so much more in the Discord. It's a really great community. So check that out if you're interested. And so that's pretty much it for this video. That is negative space and the overview and tips I can give you for UI design. This video did take me a little bit longer to make than my normal videos, so if you enjoyed it, please consider giving it a thumbs up. All those likes are greatly appreciated. Subscribe for more UI related content. I try to upload 3 times a week, so make sure you have that notification bell on so you don't miss a video. And as always, have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next one.